Now let's consider the Bretton Woods monetary system, which formed the basis of the post-World War II monetary order. This arrangement was negotiated in 1944 during the Second World War in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, pictured here. It was to last until 1971. Note that the British negotiator was the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. By the way, this was the very first time that a monetary order for pretty much the world as a whole was explicitly negotiated and constructed with written rules. The first pillar of the Bretton Woods agreements was that the US dollar was to be tied to gold at a fixed price, back then $35 an ounce. So in this sense, Bretton Woods still had some elements of a gold standard, but the right to convert dollars into gold was to be held by foreigners and not by US citizens. In this regard, it was a very limited kind of gold standard. There were also fixed exchange rates for the major currencies relative to the US dollar, so the German mark or French franc could be converted into US dollars at a fixed rate. These other currencies, however, could not be converted into gold, but there was a kind of indirect gold standard if you think of the French franc being convertible into the dollar, and the dollar ultimately having some gold backing. These fixed exchange rates, however, were to be what is called adjustable pegs. That is, if a country's balance of payments got too far out of line, the fixed exchange rate would be adjusted to help restore equilibrium. So, for instance, if a country were systematically running too high of a trade deficit, at some point in time there would be an agreement to devalue that currency and change its relative value compared to the others. We can think of the Bretton Woods system in terms of these goals. Policymakers wanted a global monetary order that was to be rule-bound and aimed toward international cooperation. At the same time, they wanted a kind of policy independence for individual nations when it came to monetary and fiscal policy, so those fixed exchange rates were not to be too tight. Keep in mind also, in the earlier years of Bretton Woods, there were very often capital controls, so it was possible to have some degree of autonomous monetary and fiscal policy combined with these fixed exchange rates. At the same time, there was a general sense that a system of floating exchange rates would lead to too much volatility, and there's also a memory of during the 1930s when it seemed that floating rates didn't always work out that well, that nations would engage in competitive devaluations trying to get export business at the expense of other nations, and given this historical memory, that was viewed as something which needed to be avoided. If you put together all of these goals, and you then have a position where the United States is really the world's dominant economic power, well, what you came up with was something like the Bretton Woods system. A big change for the Bretton Woods system comes in 1958 with the general onset of currency convertibility. This basically means that capital controls are falling away and the major European currencies can be converted freely into other currencies. This was likely necessary simply to support the growing amount of world trade and the growing quantity of global capital movements. But at the same time, once currencies became freely convertible, as we'll see, this was eventually to herald the end of the Bretton Woods system. One problem with the Bretton Woods system is that this whole idea of the adjustable pegs eventually proved to be disruptive, especially once capital controls were abandoned. Markets would have the sense that governments were planning some adjustment of the peg, speculation would set in, it would break the initial peg, and for a greater discussion of this topic, see our video on speculative attacks. But in any case, this meant that governments couldn't really manage those pegs the way they wanted to, that overall the opinion of the market as to what exchange rates should be was to prove more and more influential. Another general problem of Bretton Woods, especially in the earlier years, is something called the dollar shortage. You can think of Bretton Woods as a kind of pyramid system, with the dollar as a kind of base connected to gold and the other currencies connected to the dollar. The US dollar was explicitly specified as the global reserve currency. So this meant that the US dollars were supplying liquidity for the rest of the world, but in the early years of Bretton Woods, arguably the United States was not creating enough dollars, and the rest of the world experienced this kind of currency shortage because US monetary policy was being set in accord with the interests of the United States and not in accord with the interests of the global community as a whole. This is often a general problem with the notion of dominant reserve currencies. Later on in the history of Bretton Woods, starting in the 1960s, the problem became too much inflation in terms of US dollars. American policymakers figured out they could print up more dollars and basically export that inflation to the rest of the world, that the rest of the world would have to accept those dollars at a fixed par, and this would mean that, again, we would have monetary policy for the United States being made in American interests rather than global interests. You can think of these two problems, the initial dollar shortage and later too much inflation, as reflecting one core general problem, namely that the United States economy in some ways had too much power under Bretton Woods, and Bretton Woods could work as long as other countries were willing to accept whatever it is the United States came up with. But of course, that wasn't going to be forever. Bretton Woods basically fell apart in 1971 when the United States had to close the gold window, and that meant that US dollars could no longer be converted into gold at a fixed price. What happened here? Well, the way the system had been working in the 1960s is the US was exporting inflation to the rest of the world. The rest of the world actually wanted to convert a lot of its US dollars into gold, but political pressure was placed on these countries to simply accept the dollars and not do the conversion. But come 1971, basically the French are deciding they're not going to accept this political pressure anymore. They start converting their US dollars into gold en masse, and the United States decides this is not acceptable. It breaks the convertibility link, and starting in the early 1970s, we have a rather rapid move toward a system of floating exchange rates, and all of a sudden, poof, Bretton Woods was gone. Overall, the Bretton Woods system should be thought of as a success. The global economy was in somewhat of a desperate state after the end of World War II. It recovered quite nicely, rates of economic growth ended up being very high, and economic volatility turned out to be quite low. Maybe we're not sure how much Bretton Woods deserves the credit for that, but certainly Bretton Woods did not hinder those outcomes. That said, while it was a good system for the time, it's probably a system which could not have lasted very long. In its early years, it relied on capital controls. Over the longer haul, those fixed pegs were subject to being broken by market speculative attacks, and the whole system really rested on the notion of the United States as a dominant superpower, one which over time a lot of other nations were simply not willing to accept. To read more on Bretton Woods, of course, enter the key terms into Google and scholar.google.com. One piece I find especially useful is one by Michael Bordeaux on Bretton Woods that is available online. And keep in mind there are some key components of Bretton Woods I haven't talked about in this video. The Bretton Woods system also helped set up the IMF, the World Bank, what we now call the World Trade Organization, which was formerly GATT. And for more material on these topics, you can see our other videos or simply use Google.